Hello again, it's Dips from dipsdesigns.com here. So last week my lovely niece turned 4 years old and she's absolutely mad about Paw Patrol. She's been talking about having a Paw Patrol birthday cake at her party for, well, almost a year. And for it to be absolutely paw perfect, it had to be of her favourite pup, which is Marshall. So today's step-by-step tutorial is how I made this Marshall Paw Patrol dog-shaped cake. If you follow me on my blog, you'll know that I love cake decorating and sugar craft, as well as card making and paper crafts. So please do subscribe to my channel for more video craft tutorials. But for now, let's get started. Here are the individual cakes that I'm going to use to build my 3D Paw Patrol cake. And usually I've baked 2 cakes in a couple of non-stick pudding steamers, along with a small cake in a 10cm or 4-inch round cake pan, a deeper cake in a 15cm or 6-inch round cake tin, and this little rounded cake which I baked in a half-filled 13cm or 5-inch hemisphere tin. I'll put links in the description box below on where you can find these, but also I'll explain alternatives to them as we go. I made my Marshall all in Madeira cake using a 6-egg recipe, as I wanted a large cake to feed quite a crowd. However, if you don't need as much cake, you could make the head and hat from moulding Rice Krispie treats instead. I've also put my Madeira cake recipe in the description box below too. Now, I came up with these cake sizes and shapes after printing off a picture of Marshall from the internet. I resized the image so that he's about 30cm or 12 inches tall. So I've printed his head on one sheet and his body on the other, with his collar included on both sheets. Next, I've got thin round cake boards in the following sizes: 10cm or 4 inches, which is about the size of his collar; 15cm or 6 inches, which is about the size of the bottom of the cake, plus 18cm or 7 inches, which I'm going to use for his hat, and a larger, thick 25cm or 10-inch square board to display him on. Not shown, I also have some 30cm or 12-inch and 20cm or 8-inch cake doweling rods. Finally, I'm going to use white fondant icing along with ready coloured black and red sugar paste, plus some white modelling or flour paste. I'll also use my Sugar Flair colouring paste to colour small quantities of white sugar paste for details such as the shields, collar and eyes. And I have this grey dusting powder for a little bit of titivating towards the end, and I also ended up using a silver metallic food paint too, but that's because I just can't help myself from fiddling around. I've divided the larger round cake and the 2 pudding basin cakes in half, spread them lightly with jam and buttercream and sandwiched them back together. Then to start, I spread a little bit of buttercream onto the medium round cake board, followed by the larger round cake, and I stacked one of the pudding basin cakes on top, widest section to the bottom and flush to the back of the larger round cake, again using a thin layer of buttercream to stick the cakes together. Then I pushed one of my longer cake dowels down through the centre. This is going to be the body of Marshall. I'm just going to cut to a shot of the head and body cake stacked together as I built them all up on this central dowel first of all, but now I've divided them back up into 2 sections to make it easier to work with, and also so you can see each section more clearly. So this next section, which is Marshall's neck and head, starts with the smallest cake board, which I've pierced a hole right through the centre so that it can thread onto the dowel, and spread it with a little buttercream. Onto this I've stacked the smaller round cake, followed by the remaining pudding basin, but this time with the widest section uppermost and slightly offset so that the head section stands proud of the neck on one side, like this. Finally, I've taken the largest round board and also pierced a hole right through the centre and topped this with the rounded cake, again using a little buttercream to adhere it to the board. So here again you can see the body, neck and head cake stacked top to bottom, but once I'd assembled them like this on the central dowel, I took them apart in the 3 sections and threaded them onto spare dowels to keep them in place like this. Okay, so I'm going to start carving my cake. You can see now why I baked one of the body cakes in the pudding basin, as once on the larger round cake, it not only curves up perfectly for the back of Marshall, but it also leaves a rim from the back to the front for his back legs and front paws. So I'm holding up my printout of the body and I'm starting by carving the gap between his two front legs. I want this to be exactly opposite the centre of his back, so I'm just turning the cake to make certain I'm 100% sure where the centre back is. Then I use the printout as a template to mark where to start cutting out the gap between his front legs, which is about 3/4 of the way up his body. I use a sharp serrated knife to make a cut from that point to the bottom, then cut a small wedge out from both sides of this. If I hadn't been able to bake the cake in the pudding basin, then I would have cooked two 13cm or 5-inch round cakes instead, but I would have had to do more carving to shape his carved back. Then I use the template again as a guide to where to start to shape one of the front paws, and having cut this piece out, I also use it along with the template to help me cut out the other front paw to a roughly similar size. If I seem a bit hesitant with these first cuts, it's because I was quite nervous. I'd never made a carved character before and worried about messing it up, so I hope this gives you some confidence to try this yourself, even if it is your first attempt too. Next, on one side, I'm cutting out another wedge that's the gap between his front and back legs, and again I'm using this piece as a size guide to do the other side. Then I turn the cake to look to see if both sides are roughly the same, cutting away just a little bit more. Although I have chilled my cake, it's still a bit crumbly, so I'm just being careful as I work, and I will clean away all the crumbs once I've finished. Keep referring back to your template and start to shape his back haunches. And I'll admit I made a much better job on this side than the other side, but I'm going to show you how to fix this later. So if you do accidentally cut off a bit too much, don't panic, it can be fixed. Finally, I'm going to apply a thin crumb coat of buttercream. So I've buttercreamed all over his body and legs, and now I'm using my spatula to remove any excess and to get it quite smooth. But I will be applying a thicker coat of white chocolate ganache later, so this is going to go back into the fridge whilst I work on Marshall's neck and head. So just a quick recap. I've made these from Madeira cake as I wanted a substantial cake, but you could make this head section by moulding Rice Krispie treats instead. If I'd done that, I would have layered the cake neck straight onto the previous body section and only worked on the Rice Krispie head once the neck and body were covered in the chocolate ganache layer. Hope I've not confused you with this. Back to my cake-based neck and head. The back of Marshall's head is flush and the front is the section protruding out. I start by carving out 2 eye sockets. So I have a set of small circle fondant cutters, and looking at my template, this one is just the right size to act as a guide for marking the eyes. Once again, I make sure that I know where the centre back of the head is, then press in the circle cutter to mark a circle. Luckily for me, the next smallest circle cutter in my set is the perfect size for me to use as a spacer to measure the gap between the eyes before stamping in the other eye socket. But if I didn't have either of these cutters, I would have just used my template to guide me in marking where the eyes go. Next, use your knife to cut out the eyes. Okay, now he's beginning to look more like something for a Halloween party rather than a Paw Patrol one, but it all will come good in the end. Referring back to my template, I'm going to trim a little bit off his forehead and also make the sides of his face a little squarer, as Marshall does have a sort of rectangular shaped face. Now, cover this section with buttercream too. Here's how I did the eye sockets. Rather than trying to carefully spread the buttercream around the inner of the holes, instead I completely filled them with the buttercream, and I'll use a spoon to clear out the eyes when I remove the excess buttercream, like this. And finally, the hat section. I apologise, but I obviously didn't hit record, so I've already popped the small rounded cake onto a small cake board just while I work on it, and I cut off this small section to the front and then covered it in buttercream. Again, you could have made this section in Rice Krispie treats instead of cake if you preferred. So that's now all 3 sections carved, crumb coated and popped back into the fridge to chill. Next we're on to the white chocolate ganache smooth coating. Start with the body section, spread over a thick even layer of ganache, but don't worry too much at this stage about it being ultra smooth. I'm using a chocolate ganache rather than a second layer of buttercream, as it provides a stronger base for the fondant icing, and I'm using white rather than dark chocolate so that I don't have any problems when I cover it with white sugar paste. I'll pop my recipe in the detail box below. Once completely covered with ganache, use an offset palette knife dipped in hot water then dried to smooth out the ganache, removing any excess until the cake surface is smooth and even like this. Next, insert the 3 extra 20cm or 8-inch dowels, spaced evenly around the central dowel. I'm using a food icing pen to mark these shorter dowels, using my dedicated food pliers to pull each one back out, trim it to length and reinsert it to be flush to the surface of the cake. However, it's really important to make sure that you do not trim down the taller central dowel, and you'll see why that is now. Add some ganache on the top of the body, which is going to act as a glue between the body and the head. Carefully lift up the head and neck, still with the temporary dowel in it, and which, if you remember, is on a cake board that crucially has a hole pierced in the middle. Then I'm simply going to thread the head and neck onto the body using the central dowel to guide it into place. Just be gentle as you do this, then step back and make sure that the face is centralised to the body. Don't worry if there's a little gap where the two sections meet, the ganache and fondant will cover that up. So now that the neck and head are attached to the body, repeat the exercise of roughly covering with the ganache, but not worrying about the eyes at this point. So here it is once it's covered in the ganache, and now this is what it looks like once I've smoothed it over with a hot palette knife and used a warm spoon to cover up the insides of the eye sockets. And yes, I am aware that my cake now looks like E.T., but please keep the faith. And finally, for the ganache, I've coated and smoothed the small rounded cake too. Right, that's all the hard work out of the way. Now we're on to the fun stuff. First of all, I've covered the remaining 18cm or 7-inch thin round cake board on one side in red fondant. I use a dowel to pierce through the central hole that was already in the board. Let me show you that I've also covered the square thick cake board in white sugar paste, into which I've stamped a pretty decorative border and adhered a fun black and white polka dot ribbon around the outer edge. I'm setting both of these aside to dry overnight, and this is where I got to at the end of my first day putting this cake together. Hello again! It's a new day, and today I'm turning my extraterrestrial stroke Halloween monster cake into a Paw Patrol pup. The next step is to add some detailing and features before I cover the cake with sugar paste, and I'm starting with Marshall's face. For this I have some white flour or modelling paste along with this half ball mould, which is part of a set of 3. These are really inexpensive to buy. I'll pop a link below and you'll see that it helps make the job a lot easier, along with my Dresden modelling tool. I also have to hand some dried spaghetti, a brush and some thinned royal icing, which I prefer to use rather than edible glue, but you use whatever you like to work with. You'll also see me use a little dusting bag filled with some corn flour or cornstarch and a sharp kitchen knife. I'm going to start by making Marshall's chubby cheeks by using the half ball mould. Start by dusting the mould with a little corn flour. Then roll a piece of modelling paste roughly into a ball and push it in. Don't worry at this point, as it should be a little or even a lot larger than the mould. Just press it in, then trim off the excess paste. Again, don't worry that this now looks messy. All I've done so far is make sure that I have the right amount of paste to work with. I take it out of the mould, rework the paste until it's smooth, then press it back into the mould where it's now a perfect fit. Then I use my Dresden tool to release it from the mould, and I now have the perfect half ball. For this purpose though, it's a little bit too perfect, so I pat it down very slightly. Then I repeat this for the other cheek. Next I'm going to make his snout and mouth. I roll some more of the modelling paste into a round about the size of a golf ball. Now I'm just going to mould this a bit, first of all by making the back flatter, then squaring off the sides slightly. Then I press in lightly on each side at the top. I'm sorry that you can't see very clearly what I'm doing. I will work on that for next time. Now my piece is more of an egg shape with 2 dimples. I use my Dresden tool to press in to create his open mouth, and you can see on my template that his lower jaw is set back from his upper jaw. For those of you who are old enough to remember, this now looks a bit like Pac-Man. Can you see that I've pressed the mouth much more open than the template? This is because I need to allow for the thickness of the sugar paste that will cover this. So before I attach anything, I just check the pieces that I've made against the cake in case any need adjusting, and I can see that I need to trim a little bit off the back of the snout, but the cheeks look pretty spot on. Yep, that's now much better. So I'm going to go ahead and attach these pieces to the head. To do this, I use a combination of dried spaghetti and my royal icing glue, and the way I do it is to sink 3 pieces of spaghetti halfway into the cake where the snout will sit. Then I lightly press the snout onto the spaghetti to mark where it needs to go. I'm not trying to push it on, just mark the back. Then I take out each piece of spaghetti and push it into the corresponding mark on the snout. Double check that they're in the right place. That looks fine. Then I paint a little royal icing on the back too. Now this could be belt and braces. As I've said earlier, I've not made a cake like this before, so I'd rather be ultra cautious that these details are firmly in place rather than risk having them move around when I'm covering the head in sugar paste. Then I'm going to repeat these steps to attach the cheeks, but you can see that I've slightly flattened the side of the cheek that sits next to the snout. I only need to use 2 pieces of spaghetti for each cheek, but I'm sticking with my belt and braces approach of a liberal brush of royal icing too. Whilst you shouldn't need to push too hard to attach these, you can see that I'm gently supporting the back of the head as I attach my pieces. Now let's move on to Marshall's paws, and you can see here that I've also moved the cake directly onto its display board. This is actually the most trial and error section of the work that I did, so I'll explain what I'm doing here, but also what I would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight. I start by hand rolling 3 short thin sausages of modelling paste, which I adhere to one of the front paws with a bit of royal icing. Next I decide I need to trim off the bottoms, so I take them off, trim them and reattach them, and then I repeat that for the other front paw and also the 2 back paws. However, you will see later that when I come to cover the cake, I have to take these bits off the back paws again, whilst I cover the front paws, then reattach them. So if I was starting from scratch, I'd only do these back paws once I'd completely finished the front legs and paws. Then finally, do you remember me saying that I'd trimmed a bit too much off one of the back haunches? You can see here where I've used some modelling paste to correct that, proving that even if you have got a bit trigger happy with your carving knife, it's nothing that can't be fixed. At long last, I'm going to start to cover the cake in sugar paste. I've rolled out some of the white sugar paste, and first of all I've cut 3 narrow strips of fondant. I'm going to push one into the gap between the 2 front legs, and then another each side between the front and back legs. I use either the rounded end of my Dresden tool or my bone tool to push the strips into place. Once I've got those in place, you can see me removing the modelling paste details from both back paws. Next, I take a rectangle of white sugar paste and wrap this around one of the front paws. I just lightly use my fingers and bone tool to gently ease the paste around the leg and trim off any excess as I go. Once I'm happy that I have the leg fully wrapped in the fondant, I use my bone tool to pick out the detail of the paw and my Dresden tool to tuck any straggly edges under the paw. I brush away any crumbs and repeat for the other front leg and paw. Now can you see it's not looking so good at the back between the front legs, so I'm just going to roll another quite thin strip of fondant and push that into the back there. That's better. So I'm going to cover his back legs and hind with one piece of white fondant, which I've rolled out into a long rectangle, and I've reattached the little modelling paste sausages to both of the back paws. Starting at his centre back, I drape this around, at this stage just lightly smoothing it into place, and then using a knife to trim away the excess at the front on both sides. If the fondant didn't quite grab, I used a little diluted royal icing to create a bond between the cake and the paste. Then I gently used my modelling tool and fingers to work the paste around the back legs on both sides, trimming away any excess paste with my knife. If any cracks appeared in the paste, I just used the warmth of my fingers to smooth them out. But I've also got a tip for a little later if you still end up with some imperfections. I just took my time with this, and once I had the fondant tucked over both back legs, I made sure that all was smooth around the back, then trimmed away the excess at the base. Then I use my modelling tools to mould the paste around the pads of the back paws and emphasise the hind legs. I use my knife to cut away any excess sugar paste from the top where his red jacket will go, along with my Dresden tool to tuck the rough edges under the base. A circle cutter helps to give me a good curve at the top of each front leg, and then I use my fondant blade to trim away the excess. And these tweezers help get any straggly bits, but I'm not worried about smoothing out this edge completely, and it will become clearer later why this is. Okay, so I'm going to move up to Marshall's head now, as I want to finish working with the white fondant before I move on to the coloured. I apply a very thin coating of diluted royal icing with a brush to the moulding paste, snout and cheeks to make sure that the sugar paste adheres when I cover these. You can see I take care to include his mouth, under his chin and all around the cheeks. So this is a real nuisance, as I obviously didn't hit record properly when I covered the head. Let me explain what I did. I rolled out a circle of white fondant and carefully centred it over the head and supported it from underneath as I fed it down over the central dowel. Then I gently smoothed the paste over the face, but just enough so that I could trim away any excess to reduce the weight. Then I went back over, carefully smoothing the paste over all the details, indenting the eye sockets with my thumbs and using my Dresden tool to press the paste into the mouth. It's very difficult when, like me, you film on your own, but that's no excuse, and I am so sorry to have no footage of this section. Now I just use a ball tool to emphasise where his neck starts. For the tip of Marshall's nose, I use my half ball moulds again, but this time the medium-sized one, and I've used the same process that I showed you earlier to create a half ball of black fondant. But as you can see from the template, although his nose is domed, it's also more triangular in shape, so I just gently press the sides to recreate that. And because I'm me, the dried spaghetti has made another appearance, as I'm paranoid about bits dropping off. However, before I pop the nose on, you can now see the face in closer detail, and I just want to point out some embossing that I marked onto his face with my modelling tool. Once I'd covered his head with fondant, I pressed in a line down the centre of his snout from where his nose tip sits towards his mouth. And I also used a half straw tool to mark a little dimple at the bottom of this line, as well as on each side of his sweet smile. So I've painted the bottom of his nose with a little royal icing glue, and I carefully pop it into place. Next, onto his eyes, and I'm going to start by using this shadow grey dusting powder around his eye sockets. You can also see where I use my thumbs to gently ease the sugar paste into the eye sockets when I covered Marshall's head. Use a soft dry brush to swirl the grey all around the sockets. It's a subtle effect, but it really helps give the face some shade and light rather than a uniformly flat finish. So to that end, I swap to a flat brush and use this to create a shadow in the lines I've marked on the snout too. As I have the black fondant out to make the tip of the nose, next I'm going to move on to adding his Dalmatian spots. If you look at the template, you can see that Marshall's black markings are not simple circles, but rather these asymmetrical shapes. So I've gathered together a selection of small floral petal cutters that I have in my collection, and I'm going to use these. However, if you don't have any cutters like this, just use a circle cutter or even the bottoms of piping nozzles to create the black markings. I've rolled my black paste quite thin for these, and I stamp out a shape and place it onto the face. The great thing is you want these shapes to look natural, so it really doesn't matter if they go on a bit wonky. Black fondant is quite tacky, so you may not need to do this, but you can always brush a little water onto the back of the shapes to help them stick to the cake. I did use the template to give me a guide as to where to place the black spots, especially on Marshall's face and front paws, but I also used my artistic licence, especially as these dots are a great way to disguise any imperfections from when covering the cake. Also, I've deliberately done the black markings before adding his jacket and hat, as I want some of them to appear to continue under these. I just kept going until I was happy with the overall effect. So, let's get his jacket on. I've rolled a length of red fondant long enough to wrap around the cake, and I've trimmed the bottom into a very slight curve. I've also lightly brushed the ganache with diluted royal icing to very slightly dampen it, or water would be fine instead. I start at the centre back and lay on the red sugar paste. Can you see I'm trying to lay it so that around the back it butts up to the trimmed white base, but I'm not worried about the top around the neck at this point. Once I get to the front, I wrap the two ends around, one on top of the other, then use a knife to trim away the overlap where they meet. I press my paste around the top of his front legs and use my Dresden tool to emboss where they join and remove the excess. I use the warmth of my fingers to work the seams together, and the same from cupping my hands around the body to smooth the paste into place. Then I cut away the excess paste around his neck too, before smoothing down the edge. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, that looks a bit rough around the edges, and you're quite right. However, the reason that I wasn't worried will now become clear. I have cut a strip of red paste long enough to go around the bottom of the jacket. I paint on a little diluted royal icing to help it stick, then lay this over where the white and red join, trying not to pull and stretch the paste as I work. Then I use my wheeler tool to emboss two lines of stitch effect around the trim. I used a very slightly wider length of paste to trim around the top of the legs. I just used my scissors to cut the trim roughly to length and my modelling tool to press the trim into place between the front legs. Then I cut off where the trims joined and used my wheel tool to add the stitch detail to this too. Finally, I added black gel paste to colour some white fondant grey, and I've attached a strip of this to the front of his jacket to mimic a zipper, again embossed with my stitch tool. Next I did his floppy ears, as I wanted them to set up quite a bit before I started working on Marshall's helmet. However, again with the benefit of hindsight, it would have been better to have added his collar before adding his ears. Anyhow, you can see that I've already stamped out some black markings, and I've mixed together about 1/3 modelling paste with 2/3 white fondant so that the ears will have some strength to them when they dry out. I've also cut out his ear from the template to act as a size guide, but I wanted the edge that's going to be attached to his head to be slightly larger, and I also flipped the template over so that I have a left and right ear. Again, referring to the template, I position the black markings on, then use my modelling tool to carefully press these in so that they don't sit proud of the white base. Then I turned the ears over, folded over the longer edge of one ear and spread a little royal icing along it. I pressed it into place on one side of the head. I checked to make sure that no icing was showing at the back of the ear and trimmed off any excess on the top of his head, and I just gently supported the ear until I was sure that the icing had set enough for the hold to be good. I repeated this process on the other side, and then to make sure that his ears don't droop whilst they dry, I just carefully tucked a little rolled up bubble wrap into the ears and also between the ears and the body to help keep them in shape whilst they dry. For his eyes, I've coloured some sugar paste a lovely royal blue and rolled it out. Then I took a small bit of cling film and placed it over the paste and used a circle cutter to stamp out two shapes. When I remove the waste, you can see that this gives the circles a lovely rounded, slightly domed effect. I've used the same technique with some black paste and a smaller cutter. Then I've cut out the eyes from my template and I use these as a reference to layer up the blue, followed by the black, brushed with a little water to stick it. I rolled a tiny ball of white fondant, and with this it was easier to use the tip of the paintbrush to wet where I want the white to go. Then I placed it on the black and used my modelling tool to flatten it down. Next I brushed a little diluted royal icing into the eye socket and I hand rolled a small disc of white fondant which I popped in. This was a bit too large, so I reduced the depth before popping it back in and sticking on the rest of the eye, making sure I was happy with the way he was looking once I had both eyes in place. I also rolled 6 dots of grey fondant and applied 3 to each side of his snout, using my modelling tool to lightly flatten them. He's really starting to come together now, isn't he? So you can see that I've rolled and cut a strip of yellow fondant and placed that around his neck as a collar. You can see now why it would have been better to do this before doing his ears. However, I'm not worried that the join on his collar isn't neat, as I'm just about to hide it. So I dabbed the join with a dot of royal icing and then added a little rounded rectangle of grey fondant, which is the top of Marshall's Fire Shield tag. And it's this shield that I worked on next. Separately from my template, I also printed out these images, one of the Paw Patrol shield and 3 copies of Marshall's Fire Shield. I cut these out so I had the outline, the red centre and the flame detail, and you can see that I also have matching coloured fondant for each element. Then I rolled out the grey and placed the outline image to use as a size guide, combined with a circle cutter to help achieve evenly rounded sides. So I lined the cutter up to one edge of the outline and cut away the excess, then repeated the process for the other side, then the top. And this small circle cutter helped me cut away the corners at the top. I repeated the process to create the red inner piece, but before I cut away the corners, I laid the red onto the grey to match up the corners. As the red fondant is also quite soft, this way also meant that the red shape didn't distort when I transferred it onto the grey layer. Now this bit's definitely on the fiddly side of things. I used the flame template and my mini scribe tool to cut out a flame shape from the orange paste. Then I used my small circle cutters to create a small yellow flame for the centre. And here's the finished shield all layered up. I attached it to the cake with a good blob of royal icing and held it in place for a minute or so until it stuck firmly. You may remember that the day before I'd covered the underneath of my largest round cake board with red sugar paste, and I've now also done the same to the top, trimming the paste so that none of the edge of the board shows through. I spread a generous layer of royal icing on the top of Marshall's head, then I threaded on the board using a smoother to lightly press down to make sure that I didn't leave any finger marks. Next I threaded on the last piece of cake, making sure its flat front aligned to the front of the cake. I rolled a circle of red icing and smoothed this over the cake and trimmed away the excess. I trimmed around the edge with a strip of the same yellow fondant that I'd used for the collar. Next I hand-rolled a slightly tapered sausage of red paste and then used my smoother to square the sides. Once I'd placed it on the helmet, I used my fingers to shape the end, using my template as a guide. I don't know what this part of a fireman's helmet is called, but you can see I've printed out a copy of it onto paper, and then I cut out and traced around onto a piece of food-safe cardboard, which I cut out, and it looks like this. I then covered this element on both sides with the red sugar paste too, and I stuck it to the helmet with my trusty royal icing. I followed the same steps as before to create another shield, but this time I had 4 small balls of white fondant, one slightly larger than the other 3. Using a small dab of water, I stuck the balls onto the shield in a paw pattern, lightly flattening the balls as I attached them, and that's the second shield finished. I stuck this to the front of the helmet, slightly raised off the base, so I used a little more bubble wrap to support it until the icing had dried. I also decided to add eyebrows made from very thinly rolled black fondant, and I'm really pleased that I did. Finally, before I finished for the night, I wanted to make Marshall's torch so that it could firm up overnight. This is a clear mint sweet, and I used this for the glass at the front of the torch. I've rolled a strip of black fondant and trimmed one edge straight, and I've made the handle of the torch from a thick sausage of black fondant. I rolled the mint in the strip of black fondant using a knife to keep the edge straight. Then I slotted this onto the torch handle. As black fondant is so soft, I decided to reinforce the handle with some dried spaghetti so that it wouldn't buckle as it dried. I wrapped a strip of yellow around the handle and left the torch upright with the sweet facing down to dry out overnight. But that wasn't quite finally, as I realised I'd not done his tail, and what would a pup be without a tail to wag? So I rolled a tapered sausage of white fondant, bent it to fit onto the display board, and added some black Dalmatian spots. Then I attached the tail using a piece of dried spaghetti, and then I really did call it a night. So it's the day of the party, and all I had left to do was some final titivations. I used this edible silver paint and a fine paintbrush to add a metallic sheen to Marshall's tag, shield and zipper. Then I took the blue gel colouring that I used for the eyes and diluted a small amount in distilled alcohol. I very carefully painted this around the outer edge of each eye. And here's Marshall completely finished. You can see I've attached his torch to his helmet and is all ready for the Paw Patrol birthday party. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I was thrilled with how this turned out, especially when I saw my niece's face when she spotted him. It was well worth the 20-odd hours it took to make him. Joking aside, this did take just over 2 days to make, but I think two things made it slower than it could have been. Obviously, I filmed doing this too, and that definitely adds quite a bit of time to the process. Plus, this was my first attempt at any sort of a character cake, and some things took longer as I figured out how to do them. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. You also might like to watch more of my crafting videos like these. I'm also absolutely thrilled when you take the time to comment as to what you think and ask questions. Is there any other type of decorated cake that you'd really like to see a step-by-step how-to video on? Thank you for spending your precious time with me, and bye for now.